Today's teardown brings me back. This brings me back to my early wrenching days. This is a Honda Civic D16Z6. This is a 1.6 liter single cam VTEC engine found in 92-5 Civic EX, SI hatch, and 93-5 Del Sol SIs. And this isn't something I normally go out of my way to find as a core. There's not a whole bunch of money in it. There is some. This is actually from one of our parts cars. I bought a really rusty, super crappy 93 Del Sol with over 200,000 miles on it at the auction that didn't run, assuming it had engine problems, and I was right. So we stripped the car, sold all the parts. I made plenty of money on the car selling the rear disc brake conversion, the manual swap parts, and a bunch of interior stuff. So anything that comes from this engine, if it's good, it is just profit. And if it's all scrap, well, then it's maybe 40 bucks, which, I mean, 40 bucks. We actually did try to get it started. I had a bunch of starting fluid and we tried to crank it over and I almost burned the car down. We did a compression test. The first 2 cylinders, not so great, so we stopped there and that was it. I checked that the valve train was moving and it does move, so I don't think the belt's broken, but maybe it's not timed right or perhaps it's got burned valves. I'm not quite sure, but you're gonna be alongside as I find out what went wrong with this engine. And if you're wondering about this pile of heads stacked precariously behind me in ways that you shouldn't stack good heads, well, they're not good heads. Every single one of those heads is cracked. It's pretty sad. Anyway, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is not pull the plugs. I'm actually going to pull the VTEC solenoid off the cylinder head. There's a screen inside that catches a lot of bearing material if there is any. This tells a lot about the engine's health as far as the oiling system is concerned. So we're going to get this off and check the screen. Well, the screen came off the solenoid. And that oil is really thick. Put some 1540 in there maybe. Let's clean this out a little bit. Let's drain this on the engine like it has been. And I don't really see, there's a few pieces of bearing material actually along the bottom there. Not as bad as I've seen. I've seen these things completely caked full of bearing material. So hopefully this doesn't have a bad crank or any rod bearing issues, and we'll have a good bottom end here. Next, we are going to pull the plugs and see what they look like, although this may not tell us much. The good news is that they are not Autolite plugs or something that's not supposed to be in there, but the bad news is they are very wet, and that's probably from getting fuel and spark and not enough air to combust. But they all look okay. They're just soaked in fuel and they smell it too. Now we're going to pull the valve cover off and take a look at the valve train. Well, right off the bat, I don't see anything major. I can tell you that the belt is still on the cam gear, so that's good. I don't see anything that looks like it's bent or out of place. It's kind of oil varnish, but this is pretty typical for a 200+ thousand mile motor. These usually aren't that clean unless they've been absolutely religiously oil changed. This is about normal, so nothing too bad yet. Now I'm going to turn the engine over and watch the valve train and make sure everything's moving as it should. Everything looks to be all right to me. Now I'm going to pull the upper timing cover off, but to do that I got to pull this bracket and we're going to check the timing. At this point I have the engine at top dead center. The cam gear says up at the top. The little hash marks are lined up on the crank pulley versus the outer timing cover, and it is in time, so it's definitely not a timing issue. Another thing I'd like to point out is I've seen a lot of these engines that have been severely overheated, and you will often see this cover melted. It's a dead giveaway. When this is melted, that engine has been very hot. Next, I'm going to pull this intake manifold off just to get it out of the way before we pull the cylinder head. Next, we'll get the cam gear off. Now, one of the beautiful things about these engines is that you do not have to pull the valve train to pull the cylinder head. You can pull it complete just like this. In fact, if you cut the belt, you can pull it off with the cam gear. So we're going to go ahead and get the head bolts out and lift the head. At first glance, the head gasket appears to be good. I don't see any signs that compression or coolant was making its way between the combustion chamber and a water jacket. Everything looks okay there, but I did find something. Look at the cylinder head. Now, I understand the cam and valve train are still in it, so some of the valves are going to be open, but look at that. That's not right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and put this on the tripod, and then I'm going to turn the head over so you can see that some of the valves open and some of them don't. I think you can already see an issue. This intake valve has hung open, and this exhaust valve has actually made contact with this intake valve, and it's actually damaged the seat and the head of this exhaust valve, and likely as well this intake valve. And I've seen a few other of these intake valves kind of get gummed up and stuck. I'm not going to say I've seen this before, but if you watch them close, they don't close correctly. Watch that one sink back in. So it could be that these are gummed up. This car could have sat for a long time. It had really thick oil in it. Either way, that is a huge compression loss. As well, if you look really close at this valve relief on that intake side of that piston, there's a pretty deep gouge, and that's from that valve being hung open and the piston hitting it. So there was definitely some piston to valve contact there. The other cylinders don't seem to have too much of that, but that cylinder's pretty bad. And I'm going to turn this engine over and show you the condition of the top of cylinders 2 and 3. This is not a super nice block by any stretch. Look at that. That is disgusting. It's like a rust paint. Yuck. Likely this is from condensation and sitting. I mean, this car sat on our lot for several months, and we don't know how long it sat before that. It probably sat up for a long time, judging by the condition of the car. So I'm going to give it a brake clean bath, kind of clean everything up so we can look at the condition of the bores. The bores look pretty decent. There's a few vertical scratches closer towards the wrist pin, but nothing too crazy. Cylinders 1 or cylinder 4. Cylinder 2 has some rust staining where you can tell the engine sat in one spot for quite some time. Likely collected water from condensation. I don't think it was coolant, but I mean, I could be wrong there. I didn't see any signs of that. Cylinder 3 looks a little bit better. Still some vertical scratches, and there's some rust at the top edge. Not too bad. Not perfect, but not too bad. Time to flip this thing over and hopefully not make a mess, but yeah, it's probably going to make a mess. Time to get the pan off. Sometimes they come right off and the gasket's really bad, but this is not one of those times. So I'm just going to give it a little tap. This all looks about normal. It's a little oil varnished, more than I like to see. I've seen them where they're a little bit cleaner than that, but I don't see anything out of place yet. I don't think this has a bottom end issue. We would have seen a lot more metal in the VTEC solenoid screen. But the pan looks clean as well. It's just a little sludgy. It's definitely clear that this gasket was bad. And that is, like, it's a little soft on the outside, but man, it is rock solid in other places. So let's go ahead and pull this pickup out of the way. Now we're going to try to get this crank pulley bolt out, and this is sometimes really easy. I'd say like 50% of the time it comes out every time. This is not going to be one of those times. Okay, let's get the big guns. All right, let's try it with this one. Well, that was easy. The other one just loosened it. Let's go ahead and get this lower timing cover off. It also looks like this had a leaking water pump. You can see all the dried up coolant here, and then it must have dripped down to this idler boss right here. But I don't know if it overheated or not. I really can't tell at this point. The head gasket looked good. It could have been replaced before, but it's definitely leaking coolant at some point. Go ahead and get that water pump off. Get this engine mount bracket and timing tensioner off. Now I'm going to take the oil pump off. Now it's time to pull this main cap. It's like a girdle with all the main caps in it. This is most Hondas from this era have this. Without pulling this, it's very difficult to get to the rod cap bolts. We'll get this off first. Pretty stubborn. All the main bearings look very nice. The main journals and the crank look nice. I don't think this thing was run low on oil too much. Usually you can tell on these engines. Let's go ahead and get cylinders 1 and 4 rod caps off. A little easier said than done. And while we're in here, we're going to get the other 2 cylinders as well. We'll just use an extension. Well, the rod bearings all look okay. They do have some wear, but you got to remember this car has well over 200,000 miles. The pistons look pretty good as well, but they do have some scoring, some gouges and vertical scratches along the top edge of the crown. But none of the rings seem to be stuck or locked with carbon. I don't think that was any of the issue here. I think most of that damage is probably from trying to run that after that engine sat for a long time and had water or something else in the cylinder, some of that rust. Let's go ahead and pull the crank out. Crank is good. It looks really good. All the journals are nice. No scratches, no gouges. I am very happy. This is probably the most expensive part I pulled out of this engine. The only issue is a little groove here from the rear main seal, but nothing too bad. It's a very nice crank. That was a super simple teardown, very forgiving, but that's pretty much how all these old Honda engines are, especially D-Series. Very easy to work on. I think that engine sat for some time and the intake valves got gummed up, and whoever tried to start it first, whether it was us, whether it was the auction house, or likely the person before it went to the auction, that's where the damage was done. But there was already some damage from it sitting. We saw the rust in the cylinders. There was some sort of fluid sitting on top of one of those pistons. So I don't think it was a perfect engine before that by any stretch, but I still got a lot of very good parts from that engine. And again, everything I sell from it is all profit at this point, so I'm quite happy. I think Honda cars, Honda engines from this era, this was the golden era of Honda. This is why people associate Hondas with being such reliable cars. Unfortunately, my personal opinion, I don't think the modern Hondas are quite this way. I'm not saying they're terrible by any stretch, but they certainly aren't as simple or easy to work on or as cheap to fix as cars from the 90s were, but I think that goes for everything. I hope you enjoyed this teardown. If you'd like to buy parts from this engine or any of the other engines I've torn down, I'm going to leave an email in the video description. And as always, I love all the comments, all the feedback. If there's an engine you want me to tear down, hopefully I can get my hands on it. Drop a comment. Let me know what you'd like to see, and I'll catch you on the next one.